there is a name that echoed through the Senate halls of Rome like a curse, a name that mothers whispered to silence their crying children, and that senators repeated in hushed terror when the news arrived that he was moving again. That name was Hannibal. He was not a Roman. He was not a Greek. He was something the ancient world had rarely encountered, a commander so tactically brilliant, so relentlessly driven, so personally magnetic that the greatest empire the Western world had ever produced could not, for nearly 2 decades, find a way to stop him. He was the son of Carthage, and for a time he was the most dangerous man alive. Rome feared many things, but there was a period, stretching across 16 astonishing years, when Rome feared most of all a single general, camped in their own hills, eating their grain, burning their allies, and waiting. Hannibal Barca was born around 247 BC in the great North African city-state of Carthage, in what is now the northern coast of Tunisia. Carthage was no small power. It was a merchant empire, wealthy, naval, vast in its reach, that controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean with a firm and calculating hand. It had colonies along the Iberian coast, footholds in Sicily, and a shadow that stretched from Africa to the shores of Spain. And at the center of its military ambition stood the Barca family, soldiers and statesmen of fierce reputation, none more fierce than Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar was a general of considerable ability, a man who understood that Carthage's future would be shaped in Spain, in the silver mines and the martial tribes of the Iberian Peninsula. The story goes that when young Hannibal begged his father to take him on campaign, Hamilcar knelt and asked his son to swear on the altar of the gods that he would be Rome's enemy, always. The boy swore. He was 9 years old. He kept that oath for the rest of his life. He grew up on campaign, not in palaces, but in tents, in dust, among soldiers who respected his father and eventually came to worship the sun. He learned warfare not from scrolls but from the ground itself. He studied the terrain of Spain, the moods of different tribal armies, the psychology of men in fear and in courage. By his mid-20s, he had already commanded cavalry wings in battle. By 26, following the death of his brother-in-law Hasdrubal, he was appointed supreme commander of all Carthaginian forces in Spain. His soldiers, veterans who had seen many commanders, chose him by acclamation. What Rome did not yet understand was the scale of what he was facing. Hannibal was not simply a skilled soldier. He was a strategic visionary, a man who could hold the entire shape of a war in his mind, who could think in years where other generals thought in battles. He understood that Carthage could not defeat Rome at sea, not after the devastation of the First Punic War. So he would not fight Rome at sea. He would bring the war to Rome's doorstep. He would march through Spain, cross the Pyrenees, traverse the rivers of Gaul, ascend and descend the impossible, snow-choked heights of the Alps in winter, with an army of nearly 50,000 soldiers and, famously, 37 war elephants. When he descended into Italy in 218 BC, the Romans were not ready, not mentally, not militarily, not emotionally, and what followed across the next decade and a half would become one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in the history of human warfare. A saga of genius, endurance, political tragedy, and ultimately a greatness that could not quite be transformed into final victory. He won battles that military academies still study today. He outthought, outmoved, and outfought Rome on Roman soil year after year. And yet, he never took the city. That is perhaps the most haunting thing about Hannibal. Not just what he achieved, but how close he came. This is the story of that man, of the oath sworn beside an altar, of an army crossing the roof of the world, of a battle at Cannae, where 70,000 Roman soldiers fell in a single afternoon, of 16 years camped in a country that could not defeat him. and a city that ultimately decided not to recall him. It is a story of brilliance and betrayal, of a general who gave everything and received very little in return, and who died not in battle, but in exile, alone, by his own hand, still defiant. Settle in. The story of Hannibal is one worth taking slowly. I am point. It is the image of a North African general, in the dead of autumn turning to winter, standing at the foot of the Alps and looking up. Behind him stretched an army, tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry, supply trains, camp followers, and 37 elephants. Ahead of him rose the greatest natural barrier in Europe. Snow already dusted the upper passes. The trails, such as they were, had been cut by shepherds and goatherds, not armies. No force of this size had ever attempted what Hannibal was about to attempt, and yet, by every account we have, he did not hesitate. He turned to his men who were exhausted and frightened and looking at those peaks with unconcealed dread, and he gave a speech. We don't have the exact words. History rarely preserves the exact words, but the substance survives. He told them to look at the mountains, and then to look at Italy on the other side. He told them that what looked like a wall was in fact a road. He had crossed the Pyrenees. He had crossed the Rhone. The Alps were simply the last obstacle between them and everything they had come this far to reach. Then he began to climb. To understand what Hannibal was doing in Spain in the first place, we need to go back a generation, back to the bitter conclusion of the First Punic War, which ended in 241 BC, with Carthage ceding Sicily to Rome and paying a crippling indemnity. It was a humiliation that the Barca family never forgot. Hamilcar, Hannibal's father, had fought in that war and believed, to his last breath, that Carthage's revival depended on building a new empire in Spain, in the mineral wealth of Iberia, in its fierce tribal warriors who could be recruited, trained, and shaped into a fighting force to rival anything Rome could field. Hamilcar spent years doing exactly that. He built the city of Acre-Luc on the Spanish coast, extended Carthaginian influence deep into the interior, and forged alliances with Iberian tribes through a combination of military authority and strategic marriage. When he drowned crossing a river in battle in 228 BC, his son-in-law Hasdrubal continued the work, and when Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, the army, hardened, loyal, and battle-seasoned, turned to Hamilcar's eldest son by acclamation. Hannibal was 26 years old. He had spent the better part of his life in the field. He knew these men, he knew this land, and he had a plan that was breathtaking in its ambition. Rome had a treaty with Carthage, the Treaty of Ebro, which notionally kept the peace and drew a line across Spain above which Carthage agreed not to expand. Hannibal found his pretext in the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally south of that line. He besieged it. Rome protested. Hannibal took it anyway after 8 months, and then he did the thing that no one in Rome actually believed he would do. He marched north, not toward Africa, not toward a seaport, north, into Gaul. The strategic logic was, in retrospect, both audacious and coherent. Hannibal understood that Carthage could not challenge Rome at sea. The Roman navy was too powerful after the lessons of the First Punic War. A direct amphibious assault on Italy was out of the question. But Italy had a land border in the north, beyond the Alps, where Rome's control was thin and the Gallic tribes were hostile to Roman expansion. If he could get his army through those mountains and into the Po Valley, he would be on Roman soil, among peoples who might welcome him as a liberator, and he could force Rome to fight him on terms of his choosing rather than theirs. It was, on paper, a plan of genius. On the ground, it was a nightmare. He left Cartagena in the late spring of 218 BC with approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and the 37 elephants. Those numbers would shrink dramatically before he ever reached the Alps. Crossing the Pyrenees cost him men. Through combat with resistant Iberian tribes, through illness, and through desertion by soldiers who took one look at the mountains and decided that whatever Hannibal was promising was not worth it. He let those men go. He did not want soldiers who had decided the cause was lost before it began. He crossed the Rhone next, which was itself a significant operation. The river was wide, fast, and the Gallic tribes on the far bank had no interest in allowing a Carthaginian army across their territory. Hannibal sent a cavalry detachment upriver to cross at a narrower point and swing around behind the Gallic position. When those horsemen lit signal fires on the far bank, the main force began crossing on hastily constructed rafts and commandeered boats. The elephants were a particular challenge. According to the historian Polybius, the Carthaginians built large earth-covered rafts extending from the bank into the river, lashing them together until the whole structure resembled a peninsula. They then led the elephants onto these, one by one, and pushed the final raft free. The elephants, confused and frightened, did what frightened elephants do on unstable ground, but they stayed on the rafts, and they crossed. By the time a Roman cavalry detachment arrived to intercept him, Hannibal was already on the eastern bank and moving north. The Alpine crossing itself took approximately 15 days, and it belongs in the same category as other great feats of human endurance that history has chosen not to forget. The exact route remains debated by scholars. The Col de Clapier, the Col de Mont-Cenis, the Col de la Traversette, each with its advocates and each with its evidence. What is not debated is what happened along the way. The lower passes were defended by mountain tribes who had perfected the art of attacking armies from above, sending boulders crashing down on columns strung out along narrow trails, cutting off the rear, attacking at night. Hannibal learned quickly to send light infantry ahead to occupy the high ground at dawn, before the army moved through each section, and to concentrate his most vulnerable elements. The baggage train, the elephants, in the middle of the column where they could be most protected. But the tribes were only part of the problem. The cold was the other part. The army was moving in October, and as they gained altitude, the temperature dropped, and the path became treacherous. Snow lay thick across the upper passes. Men who had spent their lives in North Africa and Spain had never experienced anything like it. Horses slipped and fell on ice-glazed rock. Supplies were lost. Men died of cold in the night, wrapped in insufficient clothing, curled against rocks that offered no real shelter. There was one particularly famous crisis on the descent. A section of the path that had collapsed in a landslide, leaving a sheer drop that the army could not cross. The animals could not be taken around it. Hannibal had the men dig and cut a new path through the rock, widening an existing ledge enough for the horses and elephants to pass. To break particularly stubborn rock, the soldiers poured vinegar over it, which reacted with the limestone and caused it to crack more easily under their tools. It was slow, grinding, miserable work, but they did it. When they finally descended into the Po Valley, Hannibal's army had been reduced to roughly 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and somewhere around the same number of elephants, though most of those would die in the Italian winter. He had lost half his force before fighting a single pitched battle on Italian soil. By any conventional military calculation, the campaign should have been over before it began. But Hannibal was not calculating conventionally. What struck the Gallic tribes of the Po Valley, and what struck Rome with cold alarm, was not simply that Hannibal had survived the crossing. It was the condition and the bearing of the men who had survived it. These soldiers had been forged by the ordeal. They were lean, hardened, furious with the confidence of men who have done something that should have been impossible. They fell on the Gallic tribes, not as a broken remnant, but as a conquering force, and those tribes, long hostile to the Roman colonization of northern Italy, joined Hannibal by the thousands. His army began to grow even as it recovered. Rome sent the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio to stop him. He was the same general who had been sent to intercept Hannibal in Gaul and arrived at the Rhone too late. Now he offered battle on the banks of the Ticino River in November of 218 BC. It was a cavalry skirmish rather than a full engagement, but the result was clear. The Roman cavalry was routed, Scipio himself was wounded, and Roman forces pulled back. The great Carthaginian had arrived. The first true test came in December at the Trebia River. A new Roman commander, Sempronius Longus, had joined Scipio with a fresh army and the consuming desire, typical of Roman commanders of this period, to fight immediately. Hannibal understood this. He baited Sempronius carefully, sending Numidian light cavalry across the icy river to sting the Roman camp at dawn. Sempronius, furious and impetuous, ordered his men across the river before they had eaten breakfast, in temperatures near freezing, against the advice of his more cautious colleagues. By the time the Romans formed up on the far bank, they were wet, cold, hungry, and already tired. In the battle that followed, Hannibal revealed something of the tactical mind that would define his Italian campaign. He had hidden a force of cavalry and infantry in the vegetation along the riverbank. At the critical moment, this force struck the Roman flanks and rear simultaneously. The Roman army disintegrated. Thousands drowned in the Trebia trying to retreat. Rome had lost its second engagement to this man, and he had been in Italy less than 2 months. The road south lay open. The Alpine crossing, brutal, costly, logistically nightmarish, had delivered Hannibal exactly where he needed to be. He was in Italy. He had an army. He had momentum, Gallic allies streaming to his banner, and a Roman Republic that was beginning for the first time to feel something it was not accustomed to feeling. Fear, not the ordinary fear of a difficult enemy or a hard campaign. Something deeper, the fear that the man in the hills to the north was not simply dangerous but different, that he operated according to a different calculus, that the normal ways of dealing with a foreign army, meet it, defeat it, dictate terms, might not apply to this general who seemed always to be thinking 3 moves ahead, who turned every Roman strength into a vulnerability, who made the terrain and the weather and the psychology of his opponents into weapons as real as swords. They would send better armies. They would send better commanders. And at a place called Lake Trasimene, in the spring of 217 BC, they would learn once more that better was not yet enough. Our vars, towers, to off. We, I are, to why, to are. Hannibal possessed this quality to a degree that history has rarely seen matched. He did not only outfight his opponents, he outthought them. He read them, their pride, their political pressures, their cultural assumptions about how war was supposed to be conducted, and he used what he read against them with the precision of a man who had studied his enemy far longer than his enemy had studied him. Nowhere was this more apparent than on the western shore of Lake Trasimene, on a cool, misty morning in the spring of 217 BC, where Hannibal committed what many historians consider the most perfectly executed ambush in the ancient world. After Trebia, Rome was shaken but not broken. That was the thing about Rome that Hannibal understood and respected. It did not collapse easily. Other city-states, other empires, might have sued for peace after 2 significant battlefield defeats in their own territory. Rome did not. It mobilized, it raised new armies, it elected new consuls, and sent them north with instructions to deal with this Carthaginian problem once and for all. The consul appointed to face Hannibal in the spring of 217 BC was Gaius Flaminius, a popular, energetic, politically ambitious man whose relationship with caution was, to put it generously, distant. He had a reputation as a man of the people, an aggressive commander who believed in action, and a senator who had made enemies among the conservative Roman aristocracy by pushing through land reforms they found distasteful. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of opponent Hannibal wanted. Hannibal spent the winter in the Po Valley resting his men, resupplying where he could, and thinking. In the spring he made a decision that was characteristically bold and characteristically calculated. Rather than march directly toward Rome along the obvious northern routes, he led his army through the marshes of the Arno Valley, a route so inhospitable that no rational commander would use it, which was precisely why he chose it. The march through those marshes lasted 4 days and 3 nights without pause, through waist-deep water, rotting ground, and air thick with insects. Men fell and drowned in the mud. Hannibal himself contracted an eye infection during this crossing that would cost him the sight in one eye, a wound he bore without apparent complaint, and which did not slow him for a single day. He emerged south of Flaminius, which meant he was now between the Roman army and Rome itself. This was not an accident. It was a provocation, carefully designed. A Roman consul could not allow a Carthaginian army to ravage the countryside between his position and the capital. It was politically unthinkable, personally humiliating, and militarily unacceptable. Hannibal knew this. He began to burn and plunder the fertile lands of Etruria with systematic thoroughness, not out of cruelty, though there was plenty of that in ancient warfare, but as a calculated insult, a taunt, a hand reaching out and slapping the face of Roman pride. "Come and fight me," every burning farm said. "Come and fight me now, before I take everything you are sworn to protect." Flaminius came. Hannibal scouted Lake Trasimene with care. The lake sat in a narrow valley in what is now Umbria, with wooded hills pressing close to the northern shore and a road running along the water's edge. The kind of road that armies used because it was there, because it was direct, because it was the obvious route south. The hills on either side were dense with trees, dropping steeply toward the lake. The valley formed a natural corridor, wide enough for an army to march through, enclosed enough for an army to be trapped in. He moved his forces into position in the night before the battle, placing his heavy infantry to block the far end of the valley. His cavalry and light troops across the entrance behind the marching Romans would use, and his main ambush forces, tens of thousands of soldiers, hidden in the wooded hills above the road, lying still in the dark in the early morning mist, waiting. The fog over the lake that morning was thick enough to reduce visibility to a matter of yards. It was, for Hannibal's purposes, perfect. Flaminius led his army into the valley at dawn without reconnoitering the hills. This was not stupidity. It was a failure born of aggression and impatience. He knew Hannibal was somewhere ahead. He could see, dimly through the mist, the Carthaginian rear guard on the road ahead drawing him forward. What he could not see because he had not looked were the thousands of men above him on the slopes, perfectly still, watching the Roman column file into the trap below. When the signal came, and accounts suggest it came when the Roman army was fully inside the valley, Hannibal's forces attacked from 3 sides simultaneously. From the hills, from the rear, sealing the entrance, from the blocking force at the far end. The Romans had no room to form up properly, no space to deploy into their standard tactical formations, no time to understand what was happening before the killing began. The battle lasted approximately 3 hours. Roman soldiers who tried to flee into the lake drowned under the weight of their armor. Those who fought in place were cut down by forces attacking from every direction at once. Flaminius himself was killed in the melee, run through by a Gallic horseman while trying to rally his men. Approximately 15,000 Romans died that morning at Trasimene. Another 6,000 who broke through the far end of the valley were hunted down and captured the following day. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe. The mist lifted by mid-morning. The lake shore was thick with Roman dead. The news reached Rome on a single sentence, delivered by the urban praetor to a crowd assembled in the Forum. The words, as Livy records them, were blunt and unadorned. "We have been beaten in a great battle." There was no elaboration because none was needed. Rome knew what it meant. Hannibal was south of the Apennines. There was no significant army between him and the city, and the consul who had been sent to stop him was dead on the shores of a lake in Etruria. Rome did what Rome did when it was genuinely afraid. It reached for an old and drastic remedy. It appointed a dictator. The man chosen was Quintus Fabius Maximus, a senior statesman and military man of considerable experience and, as events would prove, considerable wisdom. The office of dictator in the Roman Republic was not tyranny. It was an emergency mechanism, conferring absolute military authority on one man for a period not to exceed 6 months. The Senate reached for it now because it recognized that the normal political machinery, two consuls with divided authority, annual elections, senatorial debate, was not adequate for the crisis they faced. Fabius accepted the appointment and immediately made a decision that was so counterintuitive, so contrary to every Roman instinct about how war should be fought, that it would define his legacy for 2,000 years and give a new word to military vocabulary. He refused to fight, not retreat, not surrender, not ignore Hannibal, but refuse, systematically and deliberately, to engage him in the pitched battles that Hannibal needed and excelled at. Fabius understood something that the dead consuls had not. He understood that Hannibal's army, brilliant as it was, had a fundamental strategic vulnerability. It was operating deep inside enemy territory, far from Carthage, with no reliable supply line, no siege equipment to take walled cities, and no prospect of reinforcement unless Carthage decided to send one, which, for complicated political reasons back in North Africa, it was disinclined to do. Hannibal needed battles. He needed decisive victories that would shatter Roman confidence, break apart Rome's Italian allies. The network of allied cities and peoples whose loyalty and resources were the true foundation of Roman military power, and eventually force Rome to negotiate. Every battle he won brought him closer to that goal. Every battle he was denied cost him time, supplies, and the goodwill of an army that needed momentum and plunder to remain cohesive. Fabius would deny him battles. He would shadow Hannibal's army through the hills of southern Italy, keeping to high ground where Carthaginian cavalry, the arm in which Hannibal held his greatest advantage, could not operate freely. He would cut off foraging parties. He would harry stragglers. He would pick off small detachments. He would never, under any circumstances, allow Hannibal to draw him down onto open, flat ground and force the kind of engagement Hannibal had been engineering since he crossed the Alps. It was, strategically, the correct approach. It was also, politically, close to impossible to sustain. The Romans had a word for what Fabius was doing, and it was not complimentary. They called him cunctator, the delayer, and they did not mean it kindly. Roman culture was built on a deep and visceral belief in martial directness. You met your enemy, you defeated him. You did not skulk in the hills watching him burn your allies' farms while you declined to intervene. The Italian allied cities that Rome depended upon were looking to Rome for protection, and they were watching Roman armies follow Hannibal at a careful distance while their lands were stripped bare. It was humiliating. It was, by the values of the time and place, almost shameful. Fabius's own master of horse, a subordinate commander named Minucius, essentially went around him politically, winning a minor engagement against the Carthaginian foraging party and parlaying it into enough popular support that the Roman assembly took the extraordinary step of elevating him to co-equal authority with the dictator. It was an almost unprecedented interference with the office, driven entirely by the Roman public's rage at perceived cowardice. Hannibal, for his part, was aware of the political dimensions of his campaign at all times. In one episode that reveals his understanding of Roman psychology with startling clarity. His army, marching through the region of Campania, reached land belonging to Fabius himself. Hannibal gave explicit orders that Fabius's property was not to be touched, that every farm, every building, every field around it was to be burned. But Fabius's estates were to be spared. He was trying to create the impression in Rome that the dictator had a private arrangement with the enemy. It was disinformation, deployed with cool deliberation against an opponent Hannibal recognized as his most dangerous adversary. Fabius saw through it. He sold his property and used the proceeds to ransom Roman prisoners, but the damage to his reputation was already done in certain quarters, and the political pressure to abandon the strategy of avoidance mounted week by week. By the winter of 217 and into 216 BC, the Fabian strategy was unraveling, not because it had failed militarily. It hadn't, but because Rome could not sustain it politically or psychologically. New consuls were elected for 216, men who carried the mandate of a Roman people that had decided delay was dishonor and that it was time, past time, to meet Hannibal directly and destroy him. The consuls were Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Between them they assembled the largest army Rome had ever placed in the field, somewhere between 70,000 and 86,000 soldiers, depending on which ancient source you trust. It was an army that dwarfed anything Hannibal had available, an army that should, by every numerical calculation, have been able to crush the Carthaginians through sheer weight and mass, even if Hannibal ran rings around them tactically. They marched south to find him, moving toward the flat agricultural plain near the village of Cannae in the region of Apulia. The ground was level, the terrain was open. It was exactly the kind of landscape Hannibal had been trying to reach for 2 years. He had chosen it himself. He was waiting for them. He scowled at person that he had garnered. And then there are battles that transcend war entirely, that pass out of the realm of military history and into something closer to philosophy, into the study of what human intelligence, applied with absolute coldness and total mastery, is capable of producing in a single afternoon. Cannae is that kind of battle. It has been studied in every serious military academy on Earth for more than 2,000 years. Napoleon studied it. The German General Staff studied it obsessively in the years before both world wars. Dwight Eisenhower studied it. It is not studied because it was large, though it was enormous. It is not studied because it was bloody, though the bloodshed was almost incomprehensible. It is studied because it was perfect, because on the 2nd of August 2016 BC, on a flat, dusty plain in southeastern Italy, Hannibal Barca solved a problem that military commanders have wrestled with across every era of warfare. How to completely destroy an enemy army, not just defeat it, not just rout it, but annihilate it so thoroughly that it cannot reconstitute, cannot retreat and regroup, cannot fight again. And he solved it so elegantly, with such economy of means and such precision of execution, that the solution still bears his name: the double envelopment, the encirclement, Cannae. The Roman army that assembled near the village of Cannae in early August of 216 BC was, by any measure, the most formidable force Rome had ever assembled. The two consuls, Paulus and Varro, alternating command day by day as was Roman custom, had between them somewhere in the range of 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Against this, Hannibal could field approximately 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. He was outnumbered nearly 2-1 in the arm that Rome considered decisive. In cavalry, however, the balance ran sharply the other way. And Hannibal had spent 2 years in Italy making sure he understood exactly how Rome fought, exactly where its tactical assumptions were strongest, and exactly where, beneath those assumptions, the fatal weakness lay. Rome fought in the legion, a formation of tremendous discipline and pushing power, built around the idea of mass, of weight, of soldiers locked together driving forward into the enemy line with coordinated, relentless force. The Roman infantry, when it had room to operate and a clear enemy in front of it, was among the most effective fighting force of the ancient world. What it was not built for, what its very structure made difficult, was dealing with threats from multiple directions simultaneously. The legion pushed forward. It did not easily pivot. It did not naturally defend its flanks and rear while maintaining its forward momentum. It was, to use a later metaphor, a fist, powerful in the direction it was swung, vulnerable if you could get around it. Hannibal had known this since before he crossed the Alps. Every engagement in Italy had been, in part, a study in how to exploit it. Trebia had shown him the flanking attack. Trasimene had shown him the encirclement on a strategic scale. Now, at Cannae, with the largest Roman army in history arrayed against him, he would execute both simultaneously, and he would do it in open, flat terrain, in full daylight, with no hills, no fog, no ambush, and no advantage of surprise. He would do it in plain sight, with the Romans watching, and they still would not be able to stop it. That is what makes Cannae extraordinary. It was not a trick. It was genius deployed openly, in the light of day, against a fully prepared opponent. The Roman commanders made their first critical decision the night before the battle, and it was a decision that Hannibal had anticipated and indeed encouraged. They chose to concentrate their infantry into a formation deeper and more densely packed than usual, trading width for mass, believing that if they could punch through the Carthaginian center with enough weight, they could split his army before the flanks became relevant. It was a reasonable response to numerical superiority. It was also exactly what Hannibal needed them to do. His own deployment was, on the surface, almost provocative in its apparent weakness. He placed his least reliable infantry, the Gauls and Spanish warriors who fought in their own traditional styles, fierce but less drilled than his African veterans, in the center of his line, bulging forward in a convex arc toward the Romans. On either end of this center he positioned his African heavy infantry, the best soldiers in his army, held back and angled inward. On the flanks he placed his cavalry, the heavy Iberian and Gallic horse on the left, facing the Roman allied cavalry, and on the right his Numidian horsemen, the finest light cavalry in the ancient world, facing the Italian allied cavalry on the Roman left. The Romans looked at this arrangement and saw, correctly, that the Carthaginian center was the weakest point. They saw the convex bulge of Gallic and Spanish infantry, and they planned to hit it hard, drive through it, and roll up the flanks from the inside. They were not wrong about the weakness. They were catastrophically wrong about what that weakness was for. The battle opened on the flanks. On the Roman right, the Iberian and Gallic heavy cavalry, commanded by Hasdrubal, one of Hannibal's most trusted officers, crashed into the Roman allied cavalry with a violence that was, by ancient accounts, almost shocking in its intensity. This was not the loose, wheeling cavalry engagement typical of ancient warfare. Hasdrubal's horsemen dismounted in places, fighting on foot beside their horses, pressing the Romans so hard and so fast that the engagement became a brutal, grinding melee rather than a flowing, mounted battle. The Roman allied cavalry on the right was destroyed, not routed, destroyed. And then, critically, Hasdrubal did not pursue the fleeing survivors. He reformed his cavalry, an act of discipline extraordinarily difficult to achieve in the chaos following a cavalry victory, and rode the length of the battlefield behind the Roman lines toward the other flank. In the center, meanwhile, the Roman infantry was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It pushed, tens of thousands of soldiers pressing forward in their dense formation, shields locked, swords thrusting, driving into the Gauls and Spaniards in Hannibal's center with the accumulated weight of the most disciplined infantry in the Western world. And the Carthaginian center gave way. It bent. The convex arc began to flatten, then to curve inward, becoming concave as the Romans pushed deeper and deeper into what felt, to the men doing the pushing, like victory. The Gallic and Spanish warriors in the center were not breaking. They were fighting hard and dying, but they were stepping back, step by step, drawing the Roman mass forward, deeper into the Carthaginian formation, the Roman flanks compressing inward as the soldiers crowded toward the perceived breakthrough in the center. The Romans were pressing so hard, packed so densely, that men in the rear ranks were pushing the men in front of them forward almost involuntarily. The formation was losing its coherence. Soldiers were too close together to swing their swords freely. The crushing density that was supposed to be their strength was becoming a liability, men stumbling over each other, unable to maneuver, locked into the forward momentum of the mass around them. And then the African infantry on the flanks turned inward. This is the moment. This is the hinge on which all of Cannae turns. The African veterans on both ends of Hannibal's line held back, fresh, watching and waiting while the Gauls and Spaniards absorbed the Roman push in the center, pivoted on command, and drove into the sides of the Roman formation. The Romans, compressed and disorganized and committed entirely to the forward push, suddenly found Hannibal's best infantry attacking them from the left and the right simultaneously. They tried to turn. There was no room to turn. They tried to respond. There was no space to respond. The formation that had been an instrument of devastating offensive power became a trap. Tens of thousands of men packed so tightly that those in the middle could not raise their weapons, while those on the edges were being cut down. At this moment, Hasdrubal's cavalry arrived at the Roman rear. The encirclement was complete. Every Roman soldier on that battlefield was now surrounded, in front by the Gallic and Spanish infantry, who had stopped retreating and turned to fight again, on both sides by the African veterans, and at the rear by the heavy cavalry that had destroyed the Roman horsemen and ridden around the entire engagement to close the circle. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to fight effectively. There was only the closing of the ring, methodically, terribly, while the afternoon sun moved across the sky above the plain of Cannae. What followed lasted several hours. It was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a killing. The Romans died in the tens of thousands, packed so tightly that the Carthaginians, at the outer edge of the encirclement, simply worked their way inward. Ancient sources give varying figures. Polybius, who is generally considered the most reliable, puts Roman dead at 70,000. Livy says 47,500 infantry and 2,700 cavalry killed, with an additional 4,000 taken prisoner. Among the dead was the consul Aemilius Paulus, who refused an offered horse and chose to die on foot with his men. Among the survivors who fled the field was the other consul, Varro, who would live to face the particular Roman punishment of being thanked by the Senate for not despairing of the Republic, a formal, cutting acknowledgement that he had lost the worst battle in Roman history and was being permitted to continue breathing. Hannibal's losses, by contrast, were somewhere between 5,700 and 8,000 men. In the aftermath of the battle, as his officers moved through the bodies and the prisoners were sorted, and the count of Roman dead mounted toward a figure that seemed almost impossible, one of Hannibal's cavalry commanders. A Carthaginian nobleman named Hannibal came to his general with a proposal. "Give me the cavalry," Hannibal said, "and in 5 days you will dine on the capital." He meant it. He believed that Rome, having lost this army, having lost 2 consuls and a generation of its aristocratic officer class in a single afternoon, was broken. That Hannibal should march immediately, that speed was everything, that the road to Rome lay open and the city itself was undefended and reeling. Hannibal declined. The reasons for this decision have been argued about for as long as Cannae has been studied, and they remain genuinely contested. He lacked siege equipment. Rome's walls were formidable. His army, though victorious, was exhausted and numerically small relative to what Rome could still summon. He may have been waiting for Carthage to send reinforcements and political support that would allow him to dictate a negotiated peace rather than attempt a siege he could not sustain. He may have believed, and there is something to this belief, that Rome's Italian allies, shocked by Cannae, would now defect in large enough numbers to strangle Rome economically and militarily without requiring him to take the city directly. Hannibal denied his cavalry and his 5 days, said something that has traveled through 2 millennia with undiminished force. He looked at his general, the man who had crossed the Alps, who had destroyed 3 Roman armies, who had just engineered the most devastating single-day military engagement the ancient world had ever seen. And he said, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use one." History has never fully decided whether Hannibal was right. What history does know is that Rome did not fall. It did what it had done after Trebia and after Trasimene, only now on a scale that required something almost beyond ordinary human endurance. It mourned. It restricted public grieving to 30 days by law, because there was simply not enough time for longer. It melted down gold dedications from its temples to make coin for new armies. It freed slaves and armed them. It sent its oldest senators into the streets to physically stop fleeing soldiers and turn them around. It refused, with a stubbornness that bordered on the irrational, to accept that what had happened at Cannae meant what it appeared to mean, and it never again, for the remainder of the war, offered Hannibal the kind of battle he needed. The shadow of Cannae had fallen, but Rome was still standing in it. The promo, the spest, irisque, the sea, the sky. There is a particular kind of suffering that belongs only to those who have stood at the absolute summit of what they are capable of, who have reached the highest point a human being in their field can reach, and then watched, slowly, over years, as the world refused to yield to it. Hannibal Barca knew this suffering. He knew it intimately, across 16 years of campaigning in Italy, in a country whose roads he had memorized, whose seasons he had endured again and again, whose people he had fought and befriended and lost and buried. He had crossed the Alps. He had won Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae. He had demonstrated, repeatedly and at crushing cost to his enemy, that no Roman army sent against him in open battle could defeat him. And yet, as the years after Cannae accumulated, 215, 214, 214, one after another, with the slow weight of seasons that do not change, the shape of the war began to shift beneath him in ways that no battlefield victory could correct. He was winning every engagement that mattered militarily. He was losing the war. Understanding how that was possible requires understanding something about the nature of what Rome actually was, not the city, not the legions, but the system. Rome's power in Italy was not simply military. It was relational. It was a vast, carefully constructed web of alliances, treaties, obligations, and mutual dependencies that bound hundreds of Italian communities to Rome, in arrangements that varied from near equality to outright subordination, but that shared one crucial feature. They held. Rome's Italian allies supplied soldiers, grain, labor, and loyalty in exchange for Roman protection and a share, however unequal, in Roman prosperity and prestige. This system had been built over generations. It was the real foundation of Roman military power, not the legions themselves, but the endless capacity to replace lost legions by drawing on that allied network. Hannibal understood this. His strategy after Cannae was never primarily about taking Rome. It was about unraveling that web, convincing enough allied communities that Roman protection was a fiction, that Carthage was the rising power, that their futures lay in breaking with Rome and aligning with the man who had just destroyed 3 Roman armies on Italian soil. It was a strategy of political seduction as much as military coercion, and in the immediate aftermath of Cannae, it appeared, for a brief and dazzling moment, to be working. The defections came quickly in the months after Cannae. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to Hannibal, an act of such symbolic enormity that it shook the entire Italian peninsula. Capua was wealthy, sophisticated, politically significant, and its decision to side with Carthage sent a message to every other allied community. Watching the situation, the calculation was changing. Several Samnite tribes defected. Communities in Bruttium and Lucania went over to Hannibal. In Sicily, the death of the old King Hero of Syracuse removed a pro-Roman steadying hand, and Syracuse itself eventually slipped into the Carthaginian orbit, drawing the brilliant young Roman commander Marcellus into a long and grinding siege that occupied Roman resources and attention for years. In Macedon, King Philip V, watching Cannae's aftermath with considerable interest, signed an alliance with Carthage, raising the specter of a two-front war that would stretch Rome's capacity to its limits. And from Carthage itself, at last, there came the prospect of meaningful reinforcement. Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal was in Spain with a substantial army, and the plan, the great strategic design that Hannibal had been building toward since the crossing of the Alps, was for Hasdrubal to eventually follow his brother's route, cross the Alps with a second army, and link up with Hannibal in Italy, doubling the force available and giving Hannibal the numerical weight to finally move against Rome's walls directly. It was, in the years immediately after Cannae, a situation that looked, from the outside, like the beginning of the end for Rome. It was not, and the reasons why it was not illuminate, with painful clarity, everything that would eventually undo Hannibal's campaign. Rome's response to Cannae, once the initial shock had passed, was guided by the ghost of Fabius Maximus, not the man himself, though he remained influential, but his strategy. Rome adopted, collectively and without formally naming it, the approach that had been politically impossible before Cannae, but became politically viable after it. No more pitched battles. No more attempts to meet Hannibal on open ground and overpower him. Instead, the grinding, patient, unglamorous work of erosion. Roman armies followed Hannibal at a distance, cutting off his foragers, intercepting his supply trains, picking off detachments, and above everything else, keeping the pressure on the communities that had defected to him, making it clear that Rome had not accepted those defections, would never accept them, and would eventually return to settle accounts. This was the threat that Hannibal could not neutralize. He could beat Roman armies. He could not be everywhere at once. And Rome, denied the decisive battle it had once craved, had learned, at enormous cost, to pursue a different kind of war. A war of sieges and raids and slow strangulation. A war that played to Roman strengths of organization and resource and relentless institutional will, rather than to the individual battlefield genius that had consistently favored their opponent. Capua illustrates the dynamic perfectly. After it defected to Hannibal, Rome began systematically laying siege to it. Not immediately, not in a single dramatic assault, but in the patient Roman way, building siege lines, cutting supply routes, maintaining pressure over months and then years. Hannibal could not be everywhere. When he moved to relieve Capua, the Romans fell back and avoided engagement. When he moved away, the siege resumed. In one of the war's most famous episodes, Hannibal marched his army to within a few miles of Rome itself. The famous Hannibal ante portus, Hannibal at the gates, partly to relieve the pressure on Capua, and partly, perhaps, to see what Rome would do. Rome did something remarkable. It held an auction for the land on which Hannibal's camp stood, and the land sold at full market value. The message was theatrical but real. Rome did not consider itself beaten. It did not consider anything that Hannibal could do to be permanent. Capua eventually fell regardless. Rome sold its entire population into slavery and erased its political existence as a warning to every other community contemplating defection. And with them, the slow grinding attrition of everything Hannibal needed to sustain his campaign. His army did not significantly grow. The defecting Italian communities provided some resources and some recruits, but not on the scale the strategy required. Carthage, for reasons that combined political faction, jealousy of the Barca family's influence, and a fundamental disagreement about strategic priorities, sent reinforcements that were never adequate. A few thousand men here, some elephants there, amounts that helped at the margins but never transformed the situation. The Carthaginian Senate was dominated by a faction led by a man named Hanno, who had opposed the war from the beginning, and who continued to argue, even as Hannibal won battle after battle, that the expense was not justified by the returns. This is perhaps the bitterest element of Hannibal's Italian years. Not the Roman resistance, which was formidable and earned its ultimate success, but the failure of his own city to commit fully to the campaign he had designed. He had given Carthage 3 of the most stunning military victories of the ancient world. He had put an army in Italy and kept it there for over a decade. He had stretched Rome to the point of genuine existential crisis. And Carthage sent him trickles, the great reinforcement. The second army that would have changed everything went not to Italy, but to Spain, where Hannibal's brothers Hasdrubal and Mago were fighting their own war against a Roman force that included, increasingly, a young commander of extraordinary ability named Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the consul, who had been wounded at Ticino, a man who had survived Cannae as a junior officer, and who had spent the years since studying, with obsessive attention, everything Hannibal had done and how he had done it. The war in Spain became, paradoxically, the war that would determine the outcome in Italy. Scipio, given command of Roman forces in Spain at the improbably young age of 25, in a situation desperate enough that the Romans were willing to try something unconventional, proved to be a commander of the first order. He took Cartagena, the Carthaginian capital in Spain, in a single audacious assault. He won battles at Baecula and Ilipa, using tactics that bore unmistakably the influence of Hannibal. The feigned weakness at the center, the envelopment of the flanks, the exploitation of cavalry superiority. He had learned from watching his enemy, and he applied those lessons with a Roman general's organizational discipline behind them. When Hasdrubal finally made his move to cross the Alps and join his brother in Italy in 2007 BC, 11 years after Hannibal's original crossing, the situation in Spain was already deteriorating badly for Carthage. But Hasdrubal came nonetheless, retracing his brother's route with another army, another set of elephants, another audacious roll of the dice. Hannibal, somewhere in Bruttium in the deep south of Italy, must have known his brother was coming. He began to move north. If they could link up, if the two Barca armies could combine in central Italy, the war might yet be transformed. They never met. A Roman courier intercepted the messengers Hasdrubal had sent south to inform Hannibal of his route and his numbers. The consuls of 2000 BC, understanding what they were reading, did something that Hannibal had never quite managed to force Rome to do. They cooperated perfectly. One consul kept Hannibal pinned in the south, shadowing him and refusing engagement. The other moved north with speed to join the Second Roman Army, already facing Hasdrubal. At the Metaurus River in northern Italy, the combined Roman force caught Hasdrubal before he could find a way through them and destroyed his army. Hasdrubal himself died in the battle, reportedly charging into the Roman lines when he understood the day was lost, choosing death over survival. Hannibal learned of his brother's fate in the most brutal possible way. Roman soldiers cut off Hasdrubal's head, carried it south, and threw it into Hannibal's camp. What passed through Hannibal's mind in that moment, history does not record. What it records is that he did not break. He withdrew further into Bruttium, the toe of the Italian boot, the most remote and defensible part of the peninsula, and he continued to hold his position. His army, still undefeated in any engagement where he held command, maintained its cohesion and its loyalty to him. The soldiers who had crossed the Alps with him had mostly died or aged out over 16 years of continuous campaigning, replaced by Italians and mercenaries and men born into the army itself, but they remained his, fiercely, personally, in the way that soldiers across history have bound themselves to commanders who have kept them alive through things that should have killed them. But the strategic position was now essentially hopeless. The Metaurus had ended the possibility of meaningful reinforcement from Carthage through Italy. Spain was falling to Scipio. The Italian allies, who had defected after Cannae, were, one by one, being recaptured by Rome or surrendering in exchange for whatever terms they could negotiate. The web of alliances Hannibal had tried to unravel was being rewoven, tighter than before, knot by patient knot, and Scipio, returning from Spain in triumph, was already proposing to the Senate a strategy of radical boldness, not chasing Hannibal around Bruttium for another decade, but taking the war to Africa itself, threatening Carthage on its home ground, and forcing Hannibal to choose between Italy and his own city. The Senate debated. Fabius, old now and consistent to the end, argued against it. The risk was too great. Hannibal was still in Italy. The war could be won through patience. But Fabius was the voice of a strategy that had done its work and been superseded by events. The Senate gave Scipio his command. He crossed to Africa in 2004 BC, and Hannibal, after 16 years in Italy. 16 years of marching and fighting and winning and waiting in a country that had never quite broken, received at last the message from Carthage that he had perhaps always known would come. In one form or another, he was recalled. He boarded his ships in Bruttium and looked back at the Italian coastline as it receded. He had arrived in that country as a 29-year-old general, with an army, an oath, and an idea bold enough to shake the world. He left it at 45, undefeated, uncaptured, and unable to win. Ancient sources suggest he wept as the Italian coast disappeared behind him. Whether that is literally true or a later embellishment, it feels true. It has the emotional weight of truth, because what was receding behind him was not just a coastline. It was 16 years of his life. It was the years in which he had been, beyond any reasonable argument, the greatest military commander alive. And it was the war he had not been able to finish. He was going home. And home, he must have known, was where the ending waited. Chisai, might turns. Some collapse inward, some grow bitter and small, some rage in ways that destroy whatever dignity the years have left them. Hannibal did none of these things. What he did in the final chapter of his life was something that in its own way requires as much courage as anything he had done on a battlefield. He continued. He adapted. He governed. He plotted. He endured. And when the very last moment came, in a small house in a small kingdom on the far edge of the known world, with Roman soldiers surrounding the building and every exit closed, he made the one final decision that remained available to him with the same cold clarity he had brought to everything else. He landed in Africa in 2003 BC, and the country he returned to was not the Carthage he had left as a boy. 16 years of war had drained it. The Italian campaign had cost enormous resources for returns that, however spectacular militarily, had not translated into the political dismemberment of Rome that Hannibal had designed. Spain was lost, Sicily was lost, Sardinia was lost, and now Scipio was on African soil with a Roman army that had been forged in the Spanish campaigns into something genuinely formidable, disciplined, experienced, and commanded by a man who had spent his career preparing, consciously or not, for this specific encounter. Scipio had done something in Africa before Hannibal's arrival that demonstrated his own considerable strategic intelligence. He had cultivated an alliance with Massinissa, the king of the Numidian tribes, the same Numidians whose light cavalry had been one of Hannibal's most potent weapons throughout the Italian campaign. By the time the two armies met, Massinissa's Numidian horse rode for Rome. The tactical implication of this was significant in ways that would become clear at the battle itself. There were negotiations first. The ancient sources give us an account, embellished, almost certainly, by later writers with a taste for dramatic symmetry, of a meeting between the two commanders before the battle, somewhere on the North African plain. Hannibal, by this telling, proposed terms. He acknowledged what the war had cost both sides. He suggested a peace that would leave Carthage with its African territories and its autonomy, while conceding everything it had lost in the wider Mediterranean. He was, if the account is accurate, offering Scipio a victory without the battle, a settlement that any rational assessment of Carthage's position would have recommended. Scipio declined. The terms Rome would accept, he replied, were the terms already on the table, terms that Carthage had previously agreed to and then broken when Hannibal's return seemed to offer a better outcome. There was nothing more to discuss. They would let the armies decide. They met at Zama. The precise location is still debated by historians, somewhere in what is now northwestern Tunisia, in October of 2002 BC. Hannibal's army at Zama was not the army of Cannae. It was not the force of veterans tempered by the Alpine crossing and the Italian campaigns, soldiers who had been fighting together for years and who moved with the unconscious coordination of men who have shared every kind of hardship. That army was largely gone, some dead, some aged, some scattered across the wreckage of the wider war. What Hannibal had at Zama was an assembly of components that had never really fought together. His veterans returned from Italy, a corps of reliable professional soldiers, newly levied Carthaginian citizens, who were brave enough, but green, Gallic and Ligurian mercenaries of uncertain loyalty, and a force of 80 war elephants, which represented the largest elephant corps he had ever deployed in battle. The elephants were his opening card. He placed them across his front, and the logic was straightforward. A massed elephant charge into Roman infantry was terrifying and potentially catastrophic, capable of breaking a formation's cohesion before the real fighting began. Against the army of Trebia, something like this had worked. Against Scipio's army at Zama, it did not, for a reason that illustrates, with almost painful precision, what Scipio had learned from studying Hannibal. Scipio had trained his infantry to respond to an elephant charge not by standing firm and absorbing it, the instinct of disciplined soldiers who had been told to hold the line, but by opening lanes. The Roman maniples, the tactical subunits of the legion, parted when the elephants came, creating corridors through which the animals charged harmlessly, driven further by noise and javelins, eventually running off the flanks of the battlefield, or turning back into Hannibal's own formations in confusion and panic. The opening move. The move Hannibal had designed to shock and disorder the Roman line, failed almost completely. The elephants became a liability, rather than a weapon. On the cavalry flanks, the imbalance told quickly. Scipio's allied cavalry and Marcinis's Numidians drove Hannibal's horsemen from the field. This was the mirror image of Cannae. At Cannae, it had been Hannibal's superior cavalry that swept the Roman horse away and then returned to close the encirclement. At Zama, the same thing happened in reverse. Scipio's cavalry won the flanks and then, following the template that Hannibal himself had written at Cannae, wheeled and came back to strike Hannibal's infantry from the rear. In the center, the infantry battle was hard and prolonged. Hannibal had arranged his foot soldiers in 3 lines. The mercenaries in front, the Carthaginian levies behind them, and his Italian veterans at the back, held in reserve. His intention was to wear down the Roman infantry through the first 2 lines, and then hit them with fresh veterans at the decisive moment. The Roman infantry fought through the first line and the second with grinding, costly effort. When they reached the 3rd line, Hannibal's veterans, the men who had survived Italy, the fighting became as brutal as anything in the war. But then the cavalry returned, striking the rear of Hannibal's veteran line while it was fully engaged at the front. Scipio's horsemen completed the encirclement that the Carthaginian infantry had no room and no reserve to counter. The veteran line, the last thing holding the battle together, broke under pressure from both directions. The army collapsed. Carthaginian dead numbered somewhere around 20,000. Hannibal's losses at Zama were worse, proportionally, than anything he had inflicted on Rome at Trebia or Trasimene. He left the field alive. That, in itself, was a kind of decision. A man of Hasdrubal's temperament had chosen death at the Metaurus rather than survival and defeat. Hannibal chose to live, perhaps because he believed even then that he was not finished, perhaps simply because the instinct for survival that had kept an army intact in Italy for 16 years had not yet let him go. What followed? Zama surprised those who expected Hannibal to retire into grief or obscurity. Carthage sued for peace, accepting terms that stripped it of its fleet, its war elephants, its overseas territories, and imposed a crippling indemnity payable over 50 years. It was a crushing settlement, not quite the total destruction that Rome would eventually inflict in 46 BC, but the end of Carthage as a significant military power. Hannibal had lost the war. He had designed his entire life to win. And then he became a politician. In 196 BC, several years after Zama, Hannibal was elected Suffeti, the highest civil magistracy in Carthage, and he approached the governance of his city with the same systematic intelligence he had brought to warfare. He reformed the financial administration, reducing corruption, restructuring the mechanisms by which the war indemnity was being paid, and demonstrating in the process that the payments Rome had assumed would cripple Carthage were, under competent management, more survivable than they appeared. He proposed democratic reforms that challenged the entrenched power of the Carthaginian oligarchic council. He governed, by all accounts, effectively and honestly. Rome watched this with deep unease. A Hannibal managing armies was terrifying. A Hannibal rebuilding Carthaginian economic strength and popular legitimacy was, in some ways, a more durable threat. Roman envoys arrived in Carthage, officially to adjudicate a local dispute, but in reality to gather information about Hannibal and apply pressure. The Carthaginian oligarchs who had always resented the Barca family saw their opportunity. They accused Hannibal to the Roman envoys of correspondence with the Seleucid king Antiochus III, of planning a renewal of the war, of being still and always Rome's enemy. Whether the accusations were entirely true, partly true, or fabricated, they had the intended effect. Rome demanded Hannibal's surrender, faced with the choice between trusting Carthage to protect him, a city whose political class had never fully supported him, whose Senate had starved his campaigns of reinforcement, whose factions had worked against him even during the war, and flight. Hannibal chose flight. In 115 BC, he slipped out of Carthage by night and took ship for the east into the complex, shifting world of the Hellenistic kingdoms that filled the eastern Mediterranean. What followed was an exile that lasted the rest of his life, and it traced a slow arc across the political geography of the ancient world. As Rome's influence extended, and the spaces where a man Rome wanted could safely exist grew smaller and smaller. He went first to the court of Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, the great Hellenistic kingdom that stretched from Syria across Persia and into parts of Asia. Antiochus was preparing for war with Rome, and Hannibal offered his services and his knowledge. He proposed a strategy: land an army in Italy, revive the Italian allies, force Rome to fight on its home ground again, that bore the same essential logic as his original campaign. Antiochus, surrounded by his own generals and his own pride, gave Hannibal a naval command rather than the land army he needed, and largely ignored his strategic advice. The war with Rome went badly. Antiochus was defeated and forced to make peace, and among Rome's terms was the demand for Hannibal's surrender. He fled again, to Crete briefly, then to the court of King Prusias of Bithynia, a small kingdom in what is now northwestern Turkey. Even here, an aging Carthaginian exile in a minor court at the edge of the world, he was not idle. Ancient sources credit him with advising Prusias in a naval battle against the neighboring king, apparently directing the Bithynian ships to catapult clay pots filled with venomous snakes onto the enemy vessels, a tactic so unexpected and so upsetting to the enemy crews that it reportedly decided the engagement. Hannibal was in his 60s, in a foreign court, in a war that had nothing to do with Rome or Carthage, and he was still finding new solutions to military problems. But Rome had a long memory and a longer reach. Titus Quintius Flamininus, a Roman diplomat and commander who had dealt with Macedon and who understood the symbolic weight of names in Roman politics, arrived in Bithynia and pressed Prusias to surrender his guest. Prusias, a small king with small options, complied. Hannibal learned that soldiers were surrounding his house. He had, apparently, anticipated this moment, anticipated it with the same foresight he had always brought to the field. Ancient sources, including Livy and Plutarch, report that he had built multiple exits into his residence against exactly this possibility. He checked them, one by one, and found each one blocked. The Romans had been thorough, he is reported to have said in those final moments. And again, the exact words are the reconstruction of later writers, but the sentiment rings true to everything we know of the man, that he would release the Romans from their long anxiety about an old man, that it was unworthy of Rome, this excessive caution about a man of his age in a kingdom this small, that he would make it easier for them. He drank the poison he had kept in a ring against this day. He died in 183 BC, the same year, by ancient reckoning, as his great adversary Scipio Africanus, the man who had beaten him at Zama, the two greatest commanders of their age, departing the world together, as if history itself had arranged it for symmetry. He was 64 years old. He had crossed the Alps at 29. He had given Rome the worst military defeats in its history. He had spent 35 years, from the day he swore his oath beside his father's altar to the day he raised the ring to his lips in a surrounded house in Bithynia, in total and unrelenting opposition to the most powerful city on earth. He never broke. He never surrendered. He never stopped thinking. The Romans, who had feared him like a force of nature for the better part of a century, built no monument to him. They did not need to. Every Roman general who came after him, Scipio, Caesar, Augustus, and the commanders who served them, had studied his battles, absorbed his methods, and fought according to principles he had demonstrated on the plains of Italy. He was inside Roman military thinking, whether Rome acknowledged it or not. He was inside the way the Western world thought about warfare, about leadership, about what a single mind applied with absolute commitment to a single purpose could achieve. The oath sworn by a 9-year-old boy at an altar in Carthage, the elephants on the alpine snow, the mist over Lake Trasimene, the encircled thousands at Cannae, and the afternoon sun above them. 16 years of a country that would not yield. The poison ring. That is Hannibal. All of it, together, is Hannibal. And there is no one quite like him in all of the ancient world.